So the early months and years of the PlayStation was an interesting time, as it brought about a lot of quirky, unusual and genre-defining titles that broke new grounds, that pushed boundaries and questioned narratives that were rarely ever touched upon within the early games generations. And it also proved the point that the PlayStation wasn't just for younger audiences like other consoles that came before it. It really showcased that the PlayStation was more focused and being aimed at older audiences, more mature audiences of gamers, and it was reflective of the games that were being released at that time. One such game that would release quite early in the PlayStation's life cycle would be Loaded, which we are looking at here in this video. That released in December of 1995, being developed by Gremlin Interactive, that would later get a port to the Sega Saturn, that plays from a top-down, multi-directional perspective, that acts as a shooter game, where your main goal is to escape a prison and take out an enemy known as Fob that is on the verge of taking over or even destroying the universe. So you play from one of 6 different types of characters that are all anti-heroes, villains, psychopaths, and unfortunately they are the best hope to save the universe. Each of the characters in question all have their own traits, characteristics, abilities, weapons, features, and they all have their own individual kind of like story arc to a degree, but their goal is the same, which also adds some level of longevity to the gameplay, because in order to see all of the initial sequences for each of the characters, while they are very very short in question, you will need to play the game with each individual character to see everything available. But what's also interesting about the game is that if you have an extra controller, you can play co-op with your mates. That does add even more to the experience. One of the biggest traits around the game essentially is its level of violence and gore, even its lighting effects, as everything was very dark, dim, quite atmospheric to a degree, but the nature of the violence in question was so chaotic that everything was just happening so fast you didn't really have time to think, and if you took your eye off the ball you'd be just obliterated in an instant. But in saying that, when you were hitting or destroying enemies, you would literally obliterate them into just a sea or a mess of just guts and gore that would just literally paste and plaster the walls and floors of every hallway you walk through. Even the sound effects for its time sounded even gruesome as well, and in many ways definitely made an impact, especially if you were a younger player like myself. You wouldn't have been used to hearing things like that in a video game as such. In saying that though, for me personally, Loaded was one of the first games I'd ever played, and if you're anything like me, more than likely your first opportunity to play this game or your first experience would have come in the form of a demo that would have been part of the classic Demo 1 CD that you would have got packaged with your PlayStation upon getting it for the first time, where the game gave you access to one level from within the prison section of the game where you played as one character, and from what I remember you had one life and you had to make it count because the game was very very difficult. The game was played like say from one of the medium or harder difficulties, and your weapons would be quite weak in the beginning, so you'd have to find different resources and upgrades in order to level up your weapons abilities to make them stronger so you could defeat enemies and other threats a lot quicker. But in itself it was no easy task. What was interesting about that demo was its vast scope and its size, because the demo itself was massive. If anything, it was one of the longest demos on that demo disc itself, where you had to find a load of different coloured key cards to get into different areas and sections within the level itself. But you also had to solve some simple puzzles by flicking switches or blowing stuff up, but you also had hidden rooms that you could find by blowing up walls and different tunnels that will allow you to find other items of interest and even upgrades for all of your items and resources that would help later down the line, and you would need them because the game was very very tough. Let's just put it this way, that demo was that tough at the time that it would take you quite a few tries to master the experience, because yeah, the amount of times you would die, which I did, it was crazy. But I found it to be very very addictive because it was like nothing that I'd really seen at the time as such. Yes, I had played games like Mortal Kombat, and even up to a point before I played Loaded, I had played Resident Evil, so I suppose in many ways the violent nature of those games really stood out a mile, let's just put it that way. But Loaded was so different from a lot of other things that were out there because again, the fast paced nature of it, everything was just mental. But it was really cool, and it would reflect on the original game when it did release, because the fast paced nature of it, the violence and gore that was on offer, but even the soundtrack as well really reflected the chaotic elements within the game. So much in a way that when the game did release, it sold quite well, because like I said, it stood out from a lot of other games that were releasing on the console, which there were a lot of heavy hitters. So to see Loaded do well amongst a sea of those games like a Wipeout, Destruction Derby, Ridge Racer, you'd Tekken, you'd Battle Arena Toshinden, there was a lot of very interesting games that were being released, so it did well to stand out in the way that it did. And due to its success, a year later it did receive a sequel with Reloaded that would literally carry on directly after the end section of the first game, but the developers thought it upon themselves for somehow to try and tweak the game. While there was some visual tweaks, but the gameplay, while it was essentially the same, at the same time felt very different, because the gameplay was a lot slower. It was much more sluggish in how it was controlled and played and felt. Even your weapons just felt overly weak compared to the weapons you would get or use in the original game itself. Plus, the one thing I will say from my own personal experience with playing the original game, while I didn't play it when it did release, I played it sometime later, I found the goals and objectives in each level to not be as straightforward as that of the original game, because in the original Loaded you would often just have to either fight a boss, or you would have to find items, or literally find key cards in order to get out of an area. And the idea behind it was quite simple, even down to the map system, where it was very simplistic in how it presented itself, because it would tell you the rooms that you were in and where you needed to go, and you could have an idea of where you were at any given time. But the sequel changed all that. It removed that element of it. The map portions themselves, even when you did view the map, it didn't tell you exactly where you were on the map until you found it. It would kind of put you in mind of games like Command and Conquer and other strategy games, where portions of the map would remain hidden until you came across it, and only then would it appear on the map, which would confuse you. Plus, I just found that the overall goals and challenges, they really didn't make sense, because there were some levels you would go into and you just couldn't make sense of what you needed to do to finish the level, even though it would give you some subtle instructions, but they just felt very vague, which didn't leave for a really good experience, especially when you compare it to the first game. It ended up, in many ways, ended up being worse, which again was reflective in its reviews, but I will cover that in a future video. But I think if it had been more like the first game, yeah, it would have been decent to say the least. But in saying that, while Loaded in itself is a decent title, it does have some really cool features. For its time, it did stand out, but the gameplay aesthetic of it would have become repetitive quite quickly, because even though the game has 15 or so levels, you find that the later levels just becomes too much. The game would have been better suited to maybe 8 or 10 levels, in my opinion, because it felt like the later levels was just grinding it out. It just felt like there was too much. Now, if you were playing co-op, it might be a different story, but if you're playing on your own, yeah, it can get repetitive. And while the game did do well, and like say the sequel released a year later, the series would fall into obscurity not long after that. And I suppose it didn't help with Gremlin Interactive being bought out and acquired by Infogrames not too long after that, which pretty much would have disbanded any chance of the Loaded series continuing from that point on. But regardless, the game was decent for its time. It stood out on the console. While yes, it did also get a Saturn port, which didn't receive the same level of praise, but people liked it for what it was. The game was considered a commercial success when it did release, and it was also one of the earliest games to be added to the PlayStation Platinum Collection, which would have allowed players to gain access to games at a budget price back then, because not all of us could buy games at full price. To be fair, we couldn't. But I do genuinely think, obviously because the series pretty much disappeared within a year or two after the PlayStation being released, if that game had been released even later on in the PlayStation's life cycle, I don't think it would have done well at all, because at that point, even within a year of the PlayStation being out, the whole game and landscape and infrastructure was changing, as everything was becoming more hyper focused. You had a lot more franchises and narratives within games starting to show up. There was a lot more detail, and there was a lot more of what people wanted from the games, which you are seeing that with a lot of titles out there. So in many cases there was big shoes to fill. So Loaded definitely had its best success in the early months of the PlayStation. While it is repetitive and frustrating in parts, it's not a bad game. If anything, it is a lot of fun, especially in the earlier stages. If you're only playing it for the first time, or if you haven't played it in a while, I would recommend that you go and give it a look. While the sequel, I'll admit, isn't as good, the first game is definitely the best of the two games to play. That is a guarantee. And if you're looking for something that is high on gameplay, effects, fast-paced nature, chaotic elements, and loads of guts and gore, you'll have a blast with this one. With that being said, however, I would love to know your thoughts on this, and what did you think of it overall? Were you a fan of this game, or did you even play its less impressive sequel, and what did you think of the two games overall? So be sure to share it down in the comments below. And if you would like to see more content around more of these earlier games that did release in the early months of the PlayStation, then you can check out this next video right here. And as always, keep those gaming memories alive.